I'm Ronn Sutton, and I'm the artist on the Carson of Venus weekly Edgar Rice Burroughs online comic strip, and you're listening to True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Ronn Sutton about his 100th Carson of Venus comic strip and more. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Ronn is an illustrator and comic book artist based in Ottawa, Ontario, who's drawn several hundred comic books over the past 4 decades. This includes a 9-year stint illustrating nearly 50 issues of Elvira, Mistress of the Dark for Claypole Comics from 1998 to 2006. Among his many accolades, Ronn has been honored with the Aurora Award nominations for Best Artist and Joe Shuster Award nomination for Best Webcomic Digital Comic. Ronn's recent work includes the Dracula Visions art book and gallery show, the Galaxy Warriors movie poster, regular comic book creator magazine portraits, and penciling a religious story for Kingstone Bible. Ronn is currently drawing the webcomic adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Carson of Venus. The story of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Carson of Venus goes something like this. Carson Napier, adventurer on Earth's neighbor world, discovers that he's been tricked into delivering his own death sentence. Now he is trapped by the machinations of a cruel enemy and by his own honor. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Ronn Sutton about his 100th Carson of Venus comic strip and more. So, Ronn Sutton, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
No problem.
I appreciate your time. Before we get started, though, I want to ask you, what's on your bedside reading table? What are you reading today?
Well, I read a lot of comics, of course. I don't read any contemporary comic books for the most part. The majority of stuff I read is actually newspaper reprint strips, book collections. So I think at the moment I've got probably several Prince Valiant books on the go by Hal Foster, and then I've also got one by John Cullen Murphy, reading that as well. I've got at least one Alex Raymond Flash Gordon volume beside my bed, and probably something by some Tarzan stuff by Tom Yates as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that there's more collections being published today?
I don't know. It's today as opposed to when exactly. Going back 40 years or more, they were very far and few between. There is a lot of interest, or has been a lot of interest in the last several decades, and there's one company in particular that's been reprinting all the on-stage stuff, and Cisco Kid and a bunch of other really neat books. It's funny because, it's a very select audience that reads newspaper strips, the collections, and unfortunately a lot of stuff just isn't getting collected.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, collect all the Gray Morrow's work because I'm a huge fan of Gray Morrow's work, despite the fact that he drew Tarzan for almost 20 years. I think it was 19 years. None of it's ever been collected in book form. Nor has his Barbara Cartland romances strips. There's been 2 books of Buck Rogers by Gray Morrow, but they both were put out by different companies, put out a couple decades apart, and reprinted virtually the same stuff, which is unfortunate because it means the majority of strips haven't been reprinted.
Great. So it's a bit of a challenge, but I'm glad you're able to find something out there, that's for sure.
Yeah, I do buy loose comic strips as well, preferably not the dailies because they're just difficult to handle, but Sunday strips, some of this stuff, you've got to either buy it as loose Sunday strips from the cutout of the newspapers, or else you don't get them at all. It's
right.
One or the other.
Sure. Well, let's get talking about your latest work that you have on the go called Carson of Venus. And first of all, I want to congratulate you on your 100th strip of that story. That's tremendous. That's great. So maybe for those not familiar with the story, how would you describe it to someone?
It's one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' creations, and of course Edgar Rice Burroughs being the guy that created Tarzan, which everybody knows. He wrote, I think, somewhere in the vicinity of 80 different novels, I think there's about 25 or 26 or something Tarzan books, and then there's John Carter of Mars, and there's Pellucidar series. There's several different series, and Carson of Venus is actually it's not a lot of books. It's actually really it's 4.5 novels really. It's high adventure. It's an Earthman who ends up on Venus by accident. He was actually on his way to Mars and miscalculated, and ended up on Venus instead. As I say, high adventure. He's a hero. He does have a gun, which he rarely ever uses. It's mostly fighting with swords and fighting different monsters and creatures on the planet. I'm trying to get as much as I can out of it visually to make it fun.
Right. Yeah. Well, it sounds fun, that's for sure. But I want to know, how did you first get involved with the strip?
Well, you have to sort of back up, because what happened was, the Edgar Rice Burroughs people have a website where every Saturday they put online, it could be like 10 to 20 brand new Edgar Rice Burroughs, Sunday newspaper style strips. So they have actually 2 different Tarzan strips, and they have John Carter of Mars and, et cetera, Pellucidar. So Thomas Grinberg was who got the Burroughs people initially to start up this website, which has now been running for, I don't know, it's like 8-10 years, maybe somewhere in that vicinity. And he proposed to them that there wasn't a Tarzan newspaper strip, so he got together with Roy Thomas and they created this, brand new Tarzan strip to be online every Saturday. So he drew it for, I don't know, maybe about 3 years or maybe 4 years, I'm not sure. And I'd heard that he was leaving. So I actually put together a sample and contacted Roy Thomas and sent it to him. And Roy was interested, but he wasn't wildly enthusiastic. So I did a second sample. And again, he liked it, but he wasn't wildly enthusiastic. So I kind of went, okay, that's it. I'm not doing any more samples. And so they found somebody else to take over the strip. And afterwards, I was mad at myself for not having fought harder to get Tarzan. So I contacted them again and said, what else have you got that I could draw? And they came back to me and said, what about the Man-Eater? And of course, I had never heard of it and never read it before. So I got a copy of the novel, read it, and I drew it. It took 150 weeks to draw it, so it was 3 years, basically. It was Martin Powell writing it. I was penciling, inking it, and lettering it, and Becca Kinsey was coloring it. So we went through and completed the adaptation of the novel, and the story is basically, there's a whole sub-story about a family in Virginia where the father dies, who was a missionary in Africa, and there's a kind of a fight going on between different relatives as to who claims the inheritance. In the meantime, some of the participants go to Africa. They capture this lion, the Man-Eater. They put him on a ship. They bring him to America, not before he actually escapes on board the ship, the deck of the ship, during a huge storm with tidal waves and rain and lightning. Then you've got all these guys running around with rifles and nets trying to catch this lion, which was great visuals to draw. Lion gets brought to the States, gets sold to a circus, and so he has a whole life in the circus. Then he's on a circus train, which eventually crashes during a winter storm. And so the lion is loose in the woods during a snowstorm, and eventually makes its way to a hospital where all the participants in the story all congregate for a number of reasons, and the whole thing is finally resolved, and eventually the lion is put into sort of a zoo where it can be looked after for the rest of its life. So it's never been adapted in any other form. It's never been a movie or a TV show or a comic book or anything else. So we adapted it, and we were getting ready, Martin and I were getting ready to possibly do an original sequel to it. But as that was coming up, actually I should back up a little. At one point, the current artist on Carson of Venus decided to leave. And so once again, I contacted the Burroughs people and said, I really want to draw Carson of Venus. And they said no, for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And so I continued drawing the Man-Eater. And as I got close to the end of the Man-Eater, that current artist on Carson, he also decided to leave. And so fortunately, prior to that, I'd actually done up a couple Carson samples. So I sent the samples in to Edgar Rice Burroughs, and that time they said yes. So then I had the problem of I had to get both strips done, penciled ink, hand lettered, every week, as much as possible every week, until the man-eater ran out and I could, concentrate exclusively on Carson. So that's how it sort of came about. So I've been on Carson ever since. And as you say, I just hit my 100th episode, which is a big deal for me because even though I did 150 of the Man-Eater, the Man-Eater is very historical based, so I can do a lot of reference. I had it set in 1915, which is when the novel was written. So I had everybody in sort of Victorian clothes, and every time I was drawing stuff, whether it was cars or trains or buildings or whatever it was, furniture in a house, I would do an awful lot of research. Well, when you're doing something like Carson of Venus, there's no research to do because you have to make it all up because it's another planet and everything looks different. So that's sort of been the big challenge of it. So it was more difficult to get 100 Carsons done than it was to get 150 Man-Eaters done.
Well, still, congratulations on that. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned offline that the strip prior to your joining was very Unburroughs-like, and your goal was to make it more authentic. I wonder if you could explain that a bit further.
Sure. Well, I'm the fourth guy to draw the strip. The first artist stayed for 100 strips, and the second one stayed for, 40 strips, and the next one stayed about 45 strips. By the time I inherited Carson of Venus, it was so far removed from Edgar Rice Burroughs' vision of fantasy, high adventure vision. Basically, when I inherited the strip, Carson was wearing what amounted to be bicycle shorts and a T-shirt, and the buildings were all just very, plain and drab and boxy looking. And the thing about Carson and Venus is, it's a fantasy story. He's there, with his sandals and his loincloth and his sword and his gun, and his helmet. Well, I added the helmet. And everybody around him is attired similarly, and the structures, the buildings, I've sort of tried to take a lot of notes from, in particular, Roy Krenkel, to make the buildings very fantasy-looking, very, pseudo sort of, just very oval and very mythical-looking buildings, adding a little bit of, I guess, ancient Rome kind of architecture as well, and trying to make it a really fun sort of atmosphere. So, like I say, it just gotten way out of hand. And when I started on Carson, I couldn't suddenly change his whole attire and everything else. I had to sort of let it evolve a little bit. But certainly at the first possible opportunity, I said to Martin, I said, quick, he's got to, when he goes to bed tonight, he's going to change his clothes the next morning, so.
Very good. Very good. Now, you also mentioned you did something to the Carson of Venus logo, the strip's logo. I wonder if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, that was because the 100 was coming up. I thought we really need to make this special. Even though it's most people won't recognize the fact that it's number 100, but it's important to me. So I thought, well, one of the things I want to do is I want to change the logo because, again, the logo just looked really kind of boxy looking. Really didn't seem to show a lot of flair. So what I did was I actually started researching old editions of Carson of Venus novels, and I finally settled on the 1939 edition of Carson of Venus, and sort of took my cues for the lettering style from the front cover of the book, the typeface that they use. So I sort of took that, and I also looked at a lot of other sort of, fantasy sort of lettering that's kind of very fluid, and then sort of created a sort of a mock shield for it all to go into instead of a, rectangular box, which is how it used to look. So with 100 coming up, I was sort of holding back on using that logo. And I also approached Martin. I said, well, look, we're only working a few weeks ahead. But I said to Martin, I said, my 100th is coming up. can you write something special so that we have some nice visuals? Because where the story was at that point was Carson and Duari's father, the king, and another fellow are all in a boat, and they're heading to go see one of the other participants in the story to make sure she's okay. So basically, it was kind of just them, on the boat sailing. That would have been the number 100. And I said, well, can't we do something special? So he said, sure. So he sort of backtracked and inserted a new number 99 and inserted a new number 100 script where all of a sudden out of the water, this giant squid octopus monster thing, comes boiling out of the water and attacks all the guys in the boat and grabs Duar's father and its tentacles, and Carson's leaping through the air, to try and kill it. So we ended up with number 100. That was the scene, and it was a full page scene instead of 4 panels of the guys just floating along.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. That's for sure.
Yeah, it makes good visuals. That's for sure.
That's it. Now, I was going through my files, and I noted that when we last chatted, you mentioned you were having some challenges associated with your tools for creation. You said the purchase and delivery of Zipatone boards was kind of onerous. I'm wondering, has that changed in your creation style at all?
Oh no, it's not going to change either, because I have to order my Zipatone, which is, for people that don't know what it is, it's sheets of plastic that are sticky on one side, and on the other side it has very tiny dot patterns printed on it, and you sort of cut out a piece and stick it on your artwork. It used to be, in common use in the 50s and the 1960s in particular. But, since computers, graphics have all been being done on computers, a lot of old style tools like that they've just stopped manufacturing them. And so the only place I can actually get it now is I have to order it directly from Japan. It starts out and it's really cheap, and then I have to pay in US dollars, and then they will only deliver by DHL, which is expensive, in US dollars, and it hits the Canadian border, and I get hit for about 50% of the value in duty. So by the time I get it, it's gone up many, many, many times, and it's kind of a pain to work with. It's not nearly as good as it once was. It has a very low tack now, which means it doesn't stick to the board nearly as well as the old stuff used to, the old American-made and British-made stuff. So I have to really fight and burnish it down, and every once in a while pieces fall off that I have to glue on. But for me, I'm just working so old school. I'm drawing everything on the art boards. The lettering is done separately, but then cut out and actually glued onto the boards as well. And so the Zipatone is on the boards. So with the exception of the color, when you're looking at one of the strips, everything you see is actually on the artboard, whereas most artwork I see these days, the lettering isn't there, the tones aren't there, all the dressing I stick down to, meaning the copyright lines and the logo each week and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of work, and I forgive me for even asking this question because it's probably sacrilegious, but have you ever done any research into using, a tablet to overcome some of these difficulties when it comes to materials? Ever thought about maybe introducing a tablet of some sort, a computer tablet for drawing?
No, it doesn't appeal to me at all.
No. Okay. Because I know that there's probably some substitute that would sort of mimic it. It might not be the most, accurate thing, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's just, for me, I like working the way my heroes, used to work, be it, Alex Raymond or Al Williamson or, Gray Morrow, whoever you want to discuss. I like to think that my drawing is as good as those people, or at least I'm in the same ballpark now. And I just like the idea of, being able to work with the same tools and the same methods that they did, but it's becoming more and more difficult all the time because, as I say, stuff is being discontinued. They're just not making various things that that I need for my work. Yeah,
it's unfortunate, but I understand completely where you're coming from. That's for sure.
Yeah, everybody tells me, I could, do things easier and quicker. And, frankly, rather than start learning a whole new discipline and a whole new tools, I'd rather sort of start over somewhere else, and start, painting, actual canvas or something,
Right.
apply myself to that rather than apply myself to trying to learn how to do what I'm already doing, just with a different media,
No, that's understandable. For sure.
Yeah.
Now, we met up recently at Fan Expo in Toronto, and you were also at the Ottawa Comic Con. I wanted to ask you, what do you look forward to most when you attend these shows?
Well, it's funny because, it's very difficult to walk around the shows, especially Fan Expo, because it's so crowded and so busy. And even if I do walk around, there's really, truly nothing that appeals to me anymore, because the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, they're just not selling there at the shows. Partially because there's a limited audience, and partially because, well, I guess that's it in a nutshell. So there's nothing for me to buy. I have a real nice time talking to people. I like to sell artwork. I like to put money in my pocket. I like to sell books. I'm not so crazy about doing sketches, but I do a little bit of sketches. But yeah, it's just mostly just talking to people. And of course, after the show, going out for dinner with, a lot of my friends like Jeff Isherwood and Dave Ross and Leonard Kirk, who I haven't seen for a while, unfortunately. That's the thing that's really fun. But, it's just getting to chat with people that I only see once a year quite often, if even that frequently.
Sure. I don't want to age ourselves, but at these shows, typically I find that the audience is getting younger and younger as I was getting older. So I wanted to ask you, what is the reaction when these sort of younger, in quotes, attendees come by and to see your work? What sort of response do you get from them?
Well, either they keep walking or they start chatting, and the ones that chat, are sort of fascinated by the fact that first of all, that I'm using these antiquated methods, but also a lot of them are very impressed by the level of drawing that I'm doing. So that's sort of where we meet. It's interesting talking to them. Most of the ones that stop and talk to me have some sort of interest in that kind of adventure artwork and stuff that's sort of more reality based than, say, anime or what have you. The people that are big into anime and stuff like that go talk to somebody else, in the first place.
Yeah, it is very unique in the marketplace. As I wander around the shows, like your artwork is definitely eye catching. And certainly reminiscent of that style that certainly is missing from today. So I'm glad that people do stop by, that's for sure. So we've been talking about 100 strips of Carson of Venus, but I'm wondering, do you have anything else on the go? Are you keeping busy with other projects?
Yeah, I've always got little things that I'm doing. I've got a couple commissions. There's a fellow that I don't know if you had seen them or not, but I've been doing a series of commissions of Elvira crossover with Hilarious House of Frightenstein. So I've done 3 or 4 of those so far. But I'm just about to start on a 16-page romance story, which I'm really looking forward to doing because, I'm a guy, I don't do superheroes, so I'm kind of always been the odd duck in the comic world. I do horror and I do fantasy and I do adventure and I do, all that kind of stuff. And I've done a lot of romance stuff too. So this is going to be fun because it's actually a woman named Barbara Freelander is going to be, she's actually written the script that I'm working from. And she actually wrote a lot of DC romance comics in the 1960s and was, I think, a co-editor or something over at DC on those books. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, it sounds like you're going to be busy. So I'm wondering, where do you recommend people go online to find out more about your current and your future work?
Well, you can go to my website for sure. It's not as up to date as it probably ought to be, and it's the standard www.ronnsutton.com. Ron with 2 N's, of course. On Facebook, I pretty much try and post artwork every single day if I can. So as I'm working on some of the Carson strips, I'll post, the inked version. Prior to that, I'll post the penciled version, and prior to that, I'll often post, a lot of the roughs because I do just a ton of roughs before I commit anything to paper. So those are the 2 main things, and then of course the strips themselves are appearing on the Edgar Rice Burroughs Comics website. Thanks
to Ron for the chat. You can discover more about Ron online at ronnsutton.com, and that's RONNSUTTON, and on facebook.com/Ron_Sutton. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2022.